Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
Hey y'all, Dave here. Many people who are part of the online atheist sphere will probably recognize the name Randolf Richardson. He can often be found on other people's YouTube streams, either as a guest or in the chat, and can be found in many discussions on Twitter. Many might also know him from his role as the head of the Canadian Atheists, and his various sites dedicated to promoting atheism. In this video, we're going to take a look at one of his sites, or at least a part of that site. There are lots of entries and information on his site, and we'll be taking a look at the logic section of it. In the logic section can be found three different topics. The first is an explanation of atheism, theism, anti-theism, agnosticism, and Gnosticism. In this section, Randolf gives symbolic logic representations of each of these stances, as well as some arguments for using them this way. We won't be looking at that though. The next section is a brief discussion on propositional logic. There are lots of mistakes and errors and problems in this section. He makes mistakes about what propositions are, what the purpose of a proposition is, the purpose of truth tables, and much more. I would suggest not using this section if you want to understand anything about propositional logic. We won't be looking at this in detail here either though. We're going to be looking at this, the third topic in the logic section. In this part, Randolf discusses the law of excluded middle badly, very badly. So let's take a look at it. Down in the description below, you'll find a link to a video I made previously about the law of excluded middle. In it, I go into detail about what it is, how it works, why it works, and some other details. The video is only about 5 minutes long if you want to head over there and give it a watch before finishing this one. As that video goes into much greater detail than I would in this one, I'll skip a discussion on it. Instead, I'll just dive straight into Randolph's explanation. Randolf opens with describing what the law of excluded middle is, describing it as the assertion that a logical statement can only be true or false. The wording here is kind of odd, but he's sort of in the right area, so we can forgive him. Generally speaking, the law of excluded middle is that a proposition or declarative statement is either true or false, and there is no third middle option. I go into detail about why the law is what it is in the previously mentioned video. The next statement he makes is a little bit harder to be forgiving about though, unfortunately. Randolph's next statement mentions that the law of excluded middle is useful, but can cause false dichotomies. He argues this because there are times that there may be more than two valid options available, here citing traffic lights as an example. However, let's just remind ourselves of what the law of excluded middle is. It is a rule about propositions or declarative statements. That rule being that they can only have a value of true or false, or true or not true, with no third option. It is only declarative statements or propositions that the law of excluded middle deals with. It deals with a statement like the light is on green, or the light is on red, or the lights are not functioning. In the case of these statements, they can only be true or false. There is no third option. A similar argument you will hear from many atheists is one related to belief. You either believe God exists, or you don't believe. There is no third option available. The same applies here. The light is either on green, or it is not on green. It is either true the light is on green, or it is false that the light is on green. Same with red, yellow, not working, working, or any other statements that could be made about them. It cannot both be on red and not be on red. It cannot be both. There is no third option here. However, Randolph next claims that practitioners of logic should be aware of bifurcated thought by unnecessarily or illogically excluding other available options. He mentions that classical logic makes the mistake of incorrectly interpreting a false response to a disjunctive syllogism as an affirmative denial that infers an opposite position. So there's a lot of fancy words going on here. And to the untrained, this probably sounds pretty impressive. Let's take a closer look at this though. Let's take a look at some of the terminology going on here. Randolf uses the term bifurcated here. The term bifurcate means to divide into two branches or forks, or something that is divided into two branches or forks. In the case of a declarative statement or proposition, though, the truth values are bifurcated. There are only two options. There is only true and false. It must be one or the other, and cannot be none or both. That is the point that the law of excluded middle is making, and why it should be followed for good reasoning. The law of excluded middle does not unnecessarily exclude other options, as there are no other options. Again, for a deeper dive into why there are no other options, check out my video on the law of excluded middle, linked in the description. So, Randolph's warning about bifurcated thought excluding additional options is actually kind of meaningless, as there are no other options. Randolph's warning here comes not from good thought, but from not understanding the topic that he's discussing. The other thing that Randolph mentions is the disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive syllogism takes the form if A or B, not A, therefore B, or if A or B, A, therefore not B. The law of excluded middle does not apply to disjunctive syllogisms. It applies to the propositions in the disjunction. Let's flesh out this syllogism a little bit. Let's use premise 1, I will fail my exam, or I will have a party celebrating my success. Premise 2, I did not fail my exams. Conclusion, I will have a party celebrating my success. The disjunctive syllogism is a way of inferring certain conclusions from two different options. If the first statement in the disjunction is true, then the second is false. If the first is false, the second is true. In logic, they are seen as two mutually exclusive statements, where if one is true, then the other is false. It is either A or B. If A is not true, then B is, and vice versa. So we could say here that Randolph is right in that these kinds of thinking can exclude other available options. However, as I mentioned, the law of excluded middle does not apply to the disjunction. The law of excluded middle would apply to the statements I will fail my exams and I will have a party celebrating my success. These two statements are either true or false, and there is no third option. It cannot be both true and false that I will fail my exam, and it cannot be neither true nor false that I will fail my exam. Same with the statement, I will have a party celebrating my success. This is where the law of excluded middle applies, not the disjunction itself. There may be other options to having a party celebrating my success. The party could be cancelled, I could fall ill and not have a party, or some other thing could interfere. That would affect the soundness of the argument though, not the validity. For more on soundness and validity, see the video linked in the description. For now though, let's continue on with reviewing Randolph's section on the law of excluded middle. Randolph goes on to give us an example of where an error in the law of excluded middle can be demonstrated. The signal lights on a motor vehicle. As Randolph states, the lights are generally used to signal the driver's intent to perform a turn. Here he argues that limiting the options to just left or right signaling would create a false dichotomy, as it excludes the default of not signaling. Here we see Randolph's purpose for the argument, but this is something I'll expand on later. Randolph also discusses the hazard light, which is both lights being on simultaneously. To some degree, Randolph is correct here. To limit the possibilities of the states of the turn signals would be to create a false dichotomy. To argue something like turn signals can only be used to signal left or right would be to argue a false dichotomy. Like Randolph mentions, that would indeed be a false dichotomy. However, this isn't an application of the law of excluded middle, and wouldn't even be a misapplication of a disjunctive syllogism as he claims. This is just a bad claim. The law of excluded middle would be applied to a statement like the left turn signal is on, or the left turn signal is off, or no turn signals are showing. It wouldn't be applied to you are either turning left or you are turning right. I would agree with Randolph that attempting to apply the law of excluded middle to something like you are either turning left or you are turning right is misapplying the law of excluded middle. But nobody who understands logic would apply the law of excluded middle to something like that. It is only those who have learned enough about the law of excluded middle to make a bad argument that would misapply it in this way, something we'll come to shortly. It's in this next part that we see something I mentioned before, the actual motivations behind Randolph's argument here. It is not about accurately representing the law of excluded middle or how it is used in logic. His misrepresentation makes sense here in light of the argument being made. The actual argument being made here is one about how the words atheism and anti-theism are being used, and an argument about burden of proof. However, Randolph's entire argument about misusing the laws of excluded middle and disjunctive syllogisms and falsely limiting options and misusing logic all apply to his own argument here. Randolph argues that not believing something is distinct from believing something false, which is what much of his argument has been leading to, and what I was talking about earlier when I said we could see the purpose of this argument. The purpose of the argument is to argue for definitions of atheism and definitions of anti-theism. As can be seen, Randolph here labels not believing in deities as atheism and believing that deities do not exist as anti-theism. He argues for these definitions in another section of his website also, but I'm not going to look at them here. It's not something I'm particularly interested in covering again. To see my thoughts on definitions of atheism and anti-theism, see the corresponding videos which I'll link to in the description. The problem here is that Randolph is committing the very error that he criticizes others of in this argument. The argument here is that one either believes or does not believe, and that one is either an atheist or theist based on this. As atheism is non-belief simpliciter, believing God does not exist is another position to atheism. It is the anti-theist position. However, this ignores all the other options available. It ignores that words simply do not work in the way that Randolph is arguing here. Sure, he is free to use atheism and anti-theism that way. It's how language works. However, he is excluding all the other ways that atheism and anti-theism is used, and arguing as if these options are not valid options. Only he is couching it in misunderstandings of logic, while arguing that it is others that argue for alternate definitions of atheism that do not understand how language and logic works. He argues for the burden of proof here as well, but that'll be something for another time. The burden of proof argument being made here isn't really relevant, neither to the law of excluded middle argument he's making, or to the pushing of the definitions argument that he's making. So it isn't really something I'm interested in covering here. I'll just cover one last thing before getting to the conclusion of the video. Before getting to the conclusion of the video, let's just have a quick look at the final paragraph of Randolph's section on the law of excluded middle. I mostly agree with the first half of the first sentence in this paragraph. Those applying the law of excluded middle to things other than declarative statements and propositions where only true and false apply are not applying it correctly. Randolph declares it to be illogical, but I prefer to call it misinformed. I disagree here with his claim that debaters are using it to impose a burden of proof on those who adopt a different position. I know the argument that Randolph is speaking of here, and the argument is not about the burden of proof. It is about defining atheism, theism, and agnosticism based on propositional attitudes. The law of excluded middle is not a part of this argument. It most certainly also does not represent the final line of his argument here. Those using that argument do not argue that the only options available are believing deities exist and believing that deities do not exist. Nor do they exclude the option of non-belief simpliciter. They are simply categorizing atheism, theism, and agnosticism in different ways to how Randolph is categorizing it. If those using propositional attitudes for classification argue that it is the only way to classify these positions, then they too are wrong. They are not doing it in the manner that Randolph is arguing here, though. Just as Randolph misrepresents the law of excluded middle in this section and misrepresents what the law of excluded middle is used to argue for, so too does Randolph misrepresent these arguments. One could even argue here that Randolph is couching his own bifurcation fallacy here in language designed to point fingers elsewhere. Randolph argues that you are either atheist or you are theist. One can take an anti-theist position or believe deities do not exist, but their non-belief makes them an atheist. He argues this as if there are no other positions and paradigms that are available. He has a section on polysemy and etymology on his website, but those sections are full of the same kind of misinformation that this section is. It's all geared towards pushing the idea that you are either atheist or theist, and anyone using the term otherwise is incorrect. However, just like this section on the law of excluded middle, it is Randolf that is incorrect. Anyway, let's wrap this up. There will probably be those here who think that my main complaint is about Randolph's definition of atheism. He sure does seem to try to paint it that way every time we have this discussion. But for those that want to argue that, I suggest going and watching my video on the definition of atheism linked in the description, especially the final couple of sections of the video. This isn't my complaint here. Let me sum this up a little. The section of Randolph's site is an excellent example of everything I find wrong with the online atheist activism movement. It opens up by purporting to be about logic and the law of excluded middle. It then immediately misrepresents what the law of excluded middle is and how it is applied. It also accuses others of misapplying the law of excluded middle while misapplying the law of excluded middle. It hides its misinformation and obvious misunderstanding behind terminology that is misused and misapplied. It is designed to make the uninformed reader feel like the person writing this is really well informed and attempting to help others who are misinformed to understand where they are going wrong. But it is purposefully full of misinformation. It is not designed to help people understand logic better or understand the arguments better. It is designed to arm people with arguments against the idea that there is more than one valid definition of atheism, and push the narrative that the belief God does not exist is not atheism but anti-theism. The section also misrepresents the arguments that are being made by those who argue for positions based on propositional attitudes. Admittedly, I did not cover the section on propositional logic, but that section misrepresents what propositions are, what propositional logic is, what truth tables are, and more. It does all these things in order to push the idea that you are either an atheist or a theist, and any other options are other things based on logic. The entire thing is designed to push an ideology, while misrepresenting almost everything in order to do so. It is little different to someone like Ray Comfort, or Ken Ham, or the Discovery Institute arguing about evolution. In essence, my problem with it is that it is full of propaganda and misinformation and ideology. It purports to be educational, but it miseducates for the purpose of pushing this ideology. This miseducation is also pushed out onto places like Twitter and YouTube and other social media sites, which is then adopted by other atheists, and the propaganda and misinformation is spread. The ideas are also held dogmatically and unquestionably, and those who push it do their best to interrupt conversations where the misinformation is being corrected and people start to listen to those attempting to correct it. So this is my actual problem. It is not that I disagree with people using the lack of belief definition, as I'm often misrepresented as arguing. My problem is that it is misinformation being pushed as being correct and miseducating atheists in the name of ideology. It actively harms the atheist community and actively creates unquestionable dogmas. These are deemed to be acceptable misinformation though, because of some the ends justifies the means type of attitude. The dogmas and misinformations become uncorrectable though, and they are held unquestionably. Those who push them are seen as the ones that are correct, and those attempting to correct the misinformation are seen negatively because of the manipulative tactics like the ones Randolph uses here. As atheists and skeptics, we should be doing better. The things being done here are antithetical to good skepticism, and should be seen for what they are, pushing misinformation in the name of dogma and ideology. My complaint is these people with bigger names should be doing better. They have taken people who have left their religion and are taking advantage of that mindset in order to push their own dogmas and ideology, rather than teaching good skepticism and good critical thinking. Anyway, that's enough of a rant from me. After even more dealings with Randolph recently, and more of his dodging questions and dishonestly representing me and his continued continuing to push the kind of misinformation on his site, I needed to get it off my chest. So thanks for putting up with it. It's impossible to get people like him and people to push this kind of ideology to discuss it honestly. So it is here that I get it off my chest and get the chance to explain my actual problem. See you again soon. Until then, I hope life treats you well. Take care. Bye.